Having seen the process of island speciation and also of adaptive radiation, we're now ready to get down to the nitty-gritty of speciation. Patterns of speciation can occur in two broad contexts. The first is called allopatric speciation, where, like in the case of island speciation, the populations are physically separated, so there's no chance of mating with each other. But there can also be what's called sympatric speciation, where members of the same population may still come into contact with each other, but they become reproductively isolated. So to remember this, allo means different, whereas sim means together. And patri means homeland. So allopatric is different homelands, they're physically apart. Sympatric is the same homeland. So if we're going to have speciation where individuals might come into contact with each other, we want to look at these mechanisms of reproductive isolation. And first we want to look at prezygotic isolation. And these come in various categories. The first is ecological isolation, and that would be still allopatric like we saw with islands. But you can also have ecological isolation of two different subsets of individuals that may otherwise come into contact. They're still living in sympatry, but they nevertheless become isolated from each other. The second is with temporal isolation. So they live in the same place, but they may not be at the right place at the right time for mating. There can be behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation. So all of these can happen even if individuals from different types or different species come into physical contact with each other. So first, let's have our ecological separation, the allopatric speciation. There's a fancy term you sometimes come across in this field. It's called vicariance. We have what's originally one large continuous physical area that a barrier appears, like mountains rise or a canyon runs through it, and they become separate. And they're separated long enough so that should they come back into contact with each other, then they're separate species. The other is called peripheral isolation. So you have the normal range of the species, but off on the edge, there might be something that's, you can almost live over there. So a few individuals at the edge of the distribution may become specialized at surviving in a new and different kind of habitat. They're at the periphery of the original range. They eventually become so different, they might even be able to come back, coexist with the original, but not be able to breed with them because they're now a separate species. Now, with temporal isolation, this is sympatric, so you're in the same place, but some individuals may only want to mate at certain times of year, whereas others mate at a different time of year. And this is kind of a cute example, taking the typical mating period for 5 different species of frogs in the same pond. Wood frogs do most of their mating around April the 1st. In the same pond, the leopard frog does most of its mating about a week later. The pickerel frog mates mostly in late April, the green frog in early June, and the bullfrog not till just about July. They can all live in the same pond, but wood frog sperm is not going to meet pickerel eggs and vice versa because of the different timing of mating. You can also have behavioral isolation where mating calls diverge in areas of species overlap. Now, this is a case where the male makes a very characteristic noise to try to attract a female to mate with him. And here we have the brown tree frog and the Vera's tree frog, okay? And where they live apart, where they're physically separated from each other, it's possible to characterize the chirping sound of the brown tree frog with this, it's called a sonogram. And so there's a little pulse of noise, and it gets louder and louder, okay? And it lasts that long. With the Vera's, or the Vera's tree frog over here, it makes a bit of a pulse of noise, but it doesn't turn off completely, and it gets louder and louder and louder, and it has an longer sequence of noise. And this is a characteristic where they live apart. Now, when they live together, though, what's fascinating here is that one species or the other modifies its call so as to be more distinct, okay? So apart, the Vero's call was a little bit different from Ewing, but not much. But where they're together, this one now has a more constant sound instead of those discrete pulses of sound. Okay, and this will sound very different. A Vero's female is not going to confuse that with that. She has to make that distinction, and she'll go to the right male. And in the other part where they live together, in the eastern part of the U.S., it's now the Ewing that's modified its sound, so it's quiet most of the time and just a few occasional bloops of noise. So again, a Ewing female isn't going to make the mistake and go to the wrong male because she can recognize males of her own kind. Now, we can have mechanical isolation, and sort of a family-friendly version here of mechanical isolation and mating is with plants and bees. Bees carry the pollen of a plant from one individual to the next, and the plants are evolved so as to deposit their pollen on a specific part of the bee's body. Okay? So on this one, the pollen is going to go on one part of the bee's back, because he's going to land down here and that's going to land on his back. And this one, the pollen's going to land on its stomach. So this, or stomach, its underside, I don't think bees have stomachs, but you know what I mean. So in this case, this bee can visit two different species, but it's only going to be pollinating other flowers of this type, okay, with its own kind of pollen, with the right pollen, and this will be distinct on a separate part of its body on either side. Now, mechanical isolation can get fairly graphic. Here are some rather sweet, innocent-looking insects called damselflies. They have nice, flimsy wings and metallic, brightly colored bodies. They're really cool. And turns out that the male has a mating organ, a reproductive organ, that is a really complex shape, okay? And it's such a complex shape, and it's distinct in each different species. So these are 4 different species of damselfly, and each damselfly has its own unique, weird shape of male genitalia. That way it only fits in to the female of the right species. Okay, it's kind of like a lock and key. And so that's very effective at preventing the wrong sperm from ending up in the wrong female reproductive tract. Remember our left hand and our right hand snails. Remember that there was only possible to mate left hand to left hand, right? Or right hand to right hand, okay? Well, there are 3 different kinds, 3 different species, or rather larger groups, of snails that have this very weird handedness problem. And within these taxa, we find that the handedness is due just to a single gene. Just one mutation causes the shell to grow clockwise versus counterclockwise, okay? And within these taxa, it turns out that this is a different species from this one. They've been reproductively isolated long enough now that they are very, very different species. So mechanical isolation, it was not possible for right hand to mate with left hand. It had to be 2 right hands with each other or 2 left hands with each other. So they become a separate species from the opposite hand. That's again mechanical isolation. Pollen has to make a very extraordinary journey to another flower where it can reach the ovule or the egg and fertilize the egg of another individual. And some plants send their pollen into the air, so there's wind pollination. And this pollen's just traveling through the air at random. Now, if it lands on the right kind of flower, that is of its own species, the pollen, once it lands on the right flower, will then produce what's called a pollen tube, which allows the chromosomes, the genetic material from the pollen, to go all the way down inside the flower to fertilize the egg, okay? But if it lands on the wrong species, then it's incompatible, okay? And so the sperm may be trying to get in there, but the pollen tube doesn't grow long enough to reach the ovules. So here, the gametes actually made it to the individual of the other species, but it couldn't make it all the way to the egg, and that's called gametic isolation.